Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Politdigm channel. My name is Red, and today we're back with another episode of Politdigm Reads Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. In the last episode, we read part 2, titled Dialectics, and today we're going to be reading part 3, which is titled Historical Materialism, which is basically taking what we talked about in the last episode and applying it to history and the analysis of history. However, before the episode starts, I just want to remind you that if you enjoy our content and want to support us, you can do so over on Patreon, or if you can support us in a monetary way, you can check out our website to learn how you can support us in alternative matters. If you want to do so, there is a link in the description below. Also, make sure to join our Discord server. Anybody can join. However, if you do join and support us over on Patreon, you get access to some special perks, like being able to submit questions to our weekly Q&A that we host on the Politdigm podcast. And also make sure to support us over at our social media platforms so that you can keep up with the newest news about Politdigm and whatever we are working on. Right, so usually before I start reading the book, I usually give a bit of a summary or sort of a understanding of what was the last episode and what's to come in this episode. But if I'm going to be totally honest, I don't feel like that's really necessary in this case, and I feel like I'm just going to let the book speak for itself. So if you haven't watched the last episode, I suggest you do. So I'm just going to get started in reading the third part of this book. The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life and, next to production, the exchange of things produced is the basis of all social structure. That in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes into the modes of production and exchange. They're not to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that reason has become unreason and right-wrong, is only proof that in the modes of production and exchange changes have silently taken place with which the social order adapted to early economic conditions is no longer in keeping. From this also follows that the means of getting rid of the incongruities that have been brought to light must also be present in a more or less developed condition within the changed modes of production themselves. These means are not to be invented by deduction from fundamental principles, but are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing system of production. What is then the position of modern socialism in this connection? The present situation of society, this is now pretty generally conceded, is the creation of the ruling class of today, of the bourgeoisie. The mode of production peculiar to the bourgeoisie, known since Marx as the capitalist mode of production, was incompatible with the feudal system, with the privileges it conferred upon individuals, entire social rank, and local corporations, as well as with the hereditary ties of subordination which constituted the framework of its social organization. The bourgeoisie broke up the feudal system and built upon its ruins the capitalist order of society, the kingdom of the free competition, of personal liberty, of the equality before the law of all commodity owners, of all the rest of capitalist blessings. Henceforth, this capitalist mode of production could develop in freedom. Since steam machinery and the making of machines by machinery transformed the older manufacture into modern industry, the productive forces involved under the guidance of the bourgeoisie developed with rapidity and in a degree unheard of before. But just as the older manufacture in its time and the handicraft, becoming more developed under its influence, had come into collision with the feudal trammels of the guilds, so now modern industry in its complete development comes into collision with the bounds within which the capitalist mode of production holds it confined. The new productive forces have already outgrown the capitalistic mode of using them. And this conflict between productive forces and modes of production is not a conflict engendered in the minds of man, like that between original sin and divine justice. It exists, in fact, objectively outside us, independently of the will and action, even of the man that have brought it on. Modern socialism is nothing but the reflex, in thought, of this conflict in fact, its ideal reflection in the mind, first of the class directly suffering under it, the working class. Now, in what does this conflict consist? Before capitalist production, i.e., in the Middle Ages, the system of the petty industry obtained generally based upon the private property of the laborers in their means of production. In the country, the agriculture of small peasant, freeman, or serf. In the towns, the handicrafts organized in guilds. The instruments of labor, land, agriculture implements, the workshop, the tool, were the instruments of labor of single individuals, adapted for the use of one worker and therefore of necessity, small, dwarfish, circumscribed. But for this very reason, they belonged as a rule to the producer himself. To concentrate these scattered, limited means of production, to enlarge them, to turn them into the powerful levers of production of the present day, this was precisely the historic role of capitalist production and of its upholder, the bourgeoisie. In the fourth section of Capital, Marx has explained in detail how since the 15th century this has been historically worked out through the three phases of simple cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry. But the bourgeoisie, as is shown there, could not transform these puny means of production into mighty productive forces without transforming them, at the same time, from the means of production of individual into social means of production, only workable by a collective of men. The spinning wheel, the hand loom, the blacksmith's hammer were replaced by the spinning machine, the power loom, the steam hammer, the individual workshop by the factory, implying the cooperation of hundreds and thousands of workmen. In like manner, production itself changed from a series of individual into a series of social acts, and the production from individual to social products. The yarn, the cloth, the metal articles that now come out of the factory were the joint product of many workers, through whose hands they had successively to pass before they were ready. No one person could say of them, I made that, this is my product. But where, in a given society, the fundamental form of production is that spontaneous division of labor which creeps in gradually and not upon any preconceived plan. There, the products take on the form of commodities, whose mutual exchange, buying and selling, enable the individual producers to satisfy their manifold wants. And this was the case in the Middle Ages. The peasants, for example, sold the artisan agricultural products and bought from him the products of handicraft. Into this society of individual producers, of commodity producers, the new mode of production thrust itself. In the midst of the old division of labor, growing up spontaneously and upon no definitive plan, which had governed the whole of society, now arose division of labor upon a definitive plan, as organized in the factory. Side by side with individual production appeared social production. The products of both were sold in the same market, and therefore at prices at least approximately equal. But organization upon a definite plan was stronger than spontaneous division of labor. The factories working with the combined social forces of collectivity of individuals produced their commodities far more cheaply than the individual small producers. Individual producers succumbed in one department after another. Socialized production revolutionized all the old methods of production, but its revolutionary character was at the same time so little recognized that it was, on the contrary, introduced as a means of increasing and developing the production of commodities. When it arose, it found ready-made and made liberal use of certain machinery for the production and exchange of commodities. Merchants, capital, handicraft, wage labor. Socialized production thus introduced itself as a new form of the production of commodities. It was a matter of course that under it the old forms of appropriation remained in full swing and were applied to its products as well. In the medieval stage of evolution of the production of commodities, the question as to the owner of the product of labor could not arise. The individual producer, as a rule, had from raw material belonging to himself, and generally his own handiwork, produce it with its own tools, by the labor of his own hands or of his family. There was no need for him to appropriate the new product. It belonged wholly to him as a matter of course. His property in the product was therefore based upon his own labor. Even where external help was used, this was as a rule of little importance and very generally was compensated by something other than wage. The apprentices and journeymen of the guilds, working less for board and wages than for education, in order that they might become master craftsmen themselves. Then came the concentration of means of production and of the producers in large workshops and manufactories, their transformation into actual socialized means of production and socialized producers. But the socialized producers and the means of production and their products were still threatened after this change, just as they had been before, i.e., as the means of production and the products of individuals. Hitherto, the owner of the instruments of labor had himself appropriated the products, because, as a rule, it was his own product and the assistance of others was the exception. Now, the owner of the instruments of labor always appropriates to himself the products, although it was no longer his product, but exclusively the product of the labor of others. Thus, the products now produced socially were not appropriated by those who had actually set in motion the means of production and actually produced the commodities, but by the capitalists. The means of production and the production itself had become in essence socialized, but they were subjected to a form of appropriation which presupposed the private production of individuals, under which therefore every one owns his own products and brings it to the market. The mode of production is subjected to this form of appropriation, although it abolishes the conditions upon which the latter rests. This contradiction, which gives to the new mode of production its capitalistic character, contains the germ of the whole of the social antagonism of today. The greater the mastery obtained by the new mode of production over all important fields of production and in all manufacturing countries, the more it reduces individual production to an insignificant residue. The more clearly was brought out the incompatibility of socialized production with capitalistic appropriation. The first capitalists found, as we have said, alongside of other forms of labor, wage labor, ready-made for them on the market. But it was exceptional, complementary, accessory, transitory wage labor. The agricultural laborer, though upon occasion he hired himself out by the day, had a few acres of his own land on which he could at all events live at a pinch. The guilds were so organized that the journeymen of today became the masters of tomorrow. But all this changed as soon as the means of production became socialized and concentrated in the hands of the capitalists. The means of production, as well as the product of the individual producer, became more and more worthless. There was nothing left for him but to turn wage workers under the capitalists. Wage labor, aforetime the exception and accessory, now became the rule and all basis of all production. Aforetime complementary, it now became the sole remaining function of the worker. The wage worker for a time became a wage worker for life. The number of these permanent was further enormously increased by the breaking up of the feudal system that occurred at the same time by the disbanding of the restrainers of the feudal lords, the eviction of the peasants from their homesteads, etc. The separation was made complete between the means of production concentrated in the hands of the capitalists on the one side and the producers, possessing nothing but their labor power, on the other. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. We have seen that the capitalistic mode of production thrusts its way into a society of commodity producers, of individual producers, whose social bond was the exchange of their products. But every society based upon the production of commodities has this peculiarity, that the producers have lost their control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, and for such exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of his particular article is coming on the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good of his cost of production or even to sell his commodity at all. Anarchy reigns in socialized production. But the production of commodities, like every other form of production, has its peculiar inherent laws inseparable from it, and these laws work despite anarchy, in and through anarchy. They reveal themselves in the only persistent form of social interrelations, i.e., in exchange, and here they affect the individual producers as compulsory laws of competition. They are first unknown to these producers themselves, and have to be discovered by them gradually as the result of experience. They work themselves out, therefore, independently of the producers, and in antagonism to them, as inexorable natural laws of their particular form of production. The product governs the producer. In medieval society, especially in the earlier centuries, production was essentially directed towards satisfying the wants of the individual. It satisfied, in the main, only the wants of the producer and its family. Where relations of personal dependence existed, as in the country, it also helped to satisfy the wants of the feudal lord. In all this, there was, therefore, no exchange. The products, consequently, did not assume the character of commodities. The family of the peasant produced almost everything they wanted, clothes and furniture, as well as the means of subsistence. Only when it began to produce more than was sufficient to supply its own wants, and the payments in kind to the feudal lord, only then did it also produce commodities. This surplus, thrown into socialized exchange and offered for sale, became commodities. The artisan in the towns, it is true, had from the first to produce for exchange, but they also themselves supplied the greatest part of their individual wants. They had gardens and plots of land. They turned their cattle out into the communal forest, which also yielded them timber and firing. The woman spun flax, wool, and so forth. Production for the purpose of exchange, production of commodities, was only in its infancy. Hence, exchange was restricted, the market narrow, the methods of production stable. There was local exclusiveness without, local unity within. The market in the country, in the town, the guild. But with the extension of production of commodities, and especially with the introduction of the capitalist mode of production, the laws of commodity production, hitherto latent, came into action more openly and with greater force. The old bonds were loosened, the old exclusive limits broken through. The producers were more and more turned into independent, isolated producers of commodities. It became apparent that the production of society at large was ruled by absence of plan, by accident, by anarchy, and this anarchy grew to greater and greater height. But the chief means by aid of which the capitalist mode of production intensified this anarchy of socialized production was the exact opposite of anarchy. It was the increasing organization of production upon a social basis in every individual productive establishment. By this, the old, peaceful, stable conditions of things was ended. Wherever this organization of production was introduced into a branch of industry, it brook no other method of production by its side. The field of labor became a battleground. The great geographical discoveries and the colonization following them multiplied markets and quickened the transformation of handicraft into manufacture. The war did not simply break out between the individual producers of particular localities. The local struggles begat, in their turn, national conflicts, the commercial wars of the 17th and 18th century. Finally, modern industry and the opening of the world market made the struggle universal, and at the same time gave it an unheard of virulence. Advantages in natural or artificial conditions of production now decide the existence or non existence of individual capitalists, as well as of whole industries and countries. He that falls is remorselessly cast aside. It is the Darwinian struggle of the individual of existence transferred from nature to society with intensified violence. The condition of existence natural to the animal appears as the final term of human development. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation now presents itself as an antagonism between the organization of production in the individual workshop and the anarchy of production in society generally. The capitalistic mode of production moves in these two forms of the antagonism immanent to it from its very origin. It is never able to get out of that vicious circle, which Fourier had already discovered. What Fourier could not indeed see in his time is that this circle is gradually narrowing, that the movement becomes more and more a spiral, and must come to an end, like the movement of planets by collision with the center. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians. And it is the masses of the proletariat again who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. It is the compelling force of anarchy in social production that turns the limitless perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect his machinery more and more, under penalty of ruin. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous. If the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manual workers by a few machine workers, improvement in machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. It means, in the last instance, the production of a number of available wage workers in excess of the average needs of capital. The formation of a complete industrial reverse army, as I called it in 1845, available at the times when industry is working at high pressure, to be cast upon the street when the inevitable crash comes. A constant dead weight upon the limbs of the working class in its struggle for existence with capital, a regulator for keeping of wages down to the low level that suits the interest of capital. Thus it comes about, to quote Marx, the machinery becomes the most powerful weapon in the war of capital against the working class. That the instruments of labor constantly tear the means of subsistence out of the hands of the laborer. That the very product of the worker is turned into an instrument for his subjugation. Thus, it comes about that the economizing of the instruments of labor becomes at the same time, from the outset, the most reckless waste of labor power and robbery based upon the normal conditions under which labor functions. That machinery, the most powerful instrument for shortening labor time, becomes the most unfailing means of placing every moment of the laborer's time and that of its family the disposal of the capitalist for the purpose of expanding the value of his capital. Capital English edition, page 406. Thus it comes about that the overwork of some becomes the preliminary condition for the idleness of others, and that modern industry, which hunts after new consumers over the whole world, forces the consumption of the masses at home down to a starvation minimum, and in doing thus destroys its own home market. The law that always equilibrates the relative surplus population or industrial reserve army to the extent and energy of accumulation, this law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole, therefore, at the same time, accumulation of misery, agony, of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, i.e., on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. Marx Capital, page 661. And to accept any other division of the products from the capitalist mode of production is the same as expecting the electrodes of a battery not to decompose acidated water, not to liberate oxygen at the positive, hydrogen at the negative pole, so long as they are connected with the battery. We have seen that every increasing perfectibility of modern machinery is by the anarchy of social production turned into a compulsory law that forces the individual industrial capitalist always to improve his machinery, always to increase its productive force. The bare possibility of extending the field of production is transformed for him into a similarly compulsory law. The enormous expansive force of modern industry, compared with which that of gases is mere child's play, appears to us now as a necessity for expansion, both qualitative and quantitative, that laughs at all resistance. Such resistance is offered by consumption, by sales, by the markets for the products of modern industry. But the capacity for extension, extensive and intensive, of the markets is primarily governed by quiet, different laws that work much less energetically. The intention of the markets cannot keep pace with the extension of production. The collision becomes inevitable, and as this cannot produce any real solution as long as it does not break in pieces the capitalist mode of production, the collisions become periodic. Capitalist production has begotten another vicious circle. As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized peoples and their more or less barbaric hangers on, are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. Commerce is at a stillstand. The markets are glutted. Products accumulate as multitudinous as they are unsaleable. Hard cash disappears, credit vanishes, factories are closed, the masses of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filters off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begins to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter in turn grows into a headlong gallop of a perfect steep leash of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis, and so over and over again. We have now, since the year 1825, gone through this 5 times, and at the present moment, 1877, we are going through it for the 6th time. And the character of these crises is so clearly defined that Fourier hit all of them off when he described the first, crise pléthorique, a crisis from plethora. In these crises, the contradiction between socialized production and capitalist appropriation ends in a violent explosion. The circulation of commodities is, for the first time being, stopped. Money, the means of circulation, becomes a hindrance to circulation. All the laws of production and circulation of commodities are turned upside down. The economic collision has reached its apogee. The mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. The fact that the socialized organization of production within the factory has developed so far that it has become incompatible with the anarchy of production in society, which exists side by side with and dominates it, is brought home to the capitalists themselves by the violent concentration of capital that occurs during crisis through the ruin of many large and a still greater number of small capitalists. The whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces, its own creation. It is no longer able to turn all this mass of means of production into capital. They lie fallow, and for that very reason, the Industrial Reserve Army must also lie fallow. Means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production and of general wealth are present in abundance. But abundance becomes the source of distress and want, Fourier, because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production and subsistence into capital. For in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation in capital into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital of the means of production and subsistence stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of the material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. On the one hand, therefore, the capitalistic mode of production stands convicted of its own incapacity to further direct these productive forces. On the other, these productive forces themselves, with increasing energy, press forward to the removal of the existing contradiction, to the abolition of their quality as capital, to the practical recognition of their character as social production forces. This rebellion of the productive forces as they grow more and more powerful against their quality as capital, this stronger and stronger command that their social character shall be recognized, forces the capital class itself to treat them more and more as social productive forces, so far as it is possible other capitalist conditions. The period of industrial high pressure, with its unbound inflation of credit, not less than the crash itself, by the collapse of great capitalist establishment, tends to bring about that form of the socialization of great masses of the means of production, which we meet with the different kinds of joint stock companies. Many of these means of production and of distribution are, from the outset, so colossal that, like the railways, they exclude all other forms of capitalistic expansion. At a further stage of evolution, this form also becomes insufficient. The producers on a large scale in a particular branch of an industry in a particular country unite in a trust, a union, for the purpose of regulating production. They determine the total amount to be produced, parcel it out among themselves, and thus enforce the selling price fixed beforehand. But trusts of this kind, as soon as business becomes bad, are generally liable to break up, and on this very account, compel a yet greater concentration of association. The whole of a particular industry is turned into one gigantic joint stock company. Internal competition gives place to an internal monopoly of this one company. This has happened in 1890 with the English alkali production, which is now, after the fusion of 48 large works in the hands of one company, conducted upon a single plan and with a capital of £8 million. In the trusts, freedom of competition changes into its very opposite, into monopoly, and the production without any definitive plan of capitalistic society capitulates to the production upon a definitive plan of the invading socialistic society. Certainly, this is so far still to the benefit and advantage of the capitalists. But in this case, the exploitation is so palpable that it must break down. No nation will put up with the production conducted by trusts, with so barefaced an exploitation of community by a small band of dividend mongers. In any case, with trust or without, the official representative of capitalist society, the state, will ultimately have to undertake the direction of production. This necessity of conversion into state property is felt first in the great institutions for intercourse and communication: the post office, the telegraphs, the railways. If the crises demonstrate the incapacity of the bourgeoisie for managing any longer modern productive forces, the transformation of the great establishments of production and distribution into joint stock companies, trusts, and state property show how unnecessary the bourgeoisie are for that purpose. All the social functions of the capitalist has no further social function than that of pocketing dividends, tearing off coupons, and gambling on the stock exchange, where the different capitalists despoil one another of their capital. At first, the capitalistic mode of production forces out the workers. Now it forces out the capitalists and reduces them just as it reduces the workers to the ranks of the surplus population, although not immediately into those of the industrial reserve army. But the transformation, either into joint stock companies and trusts or into state ownership, does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces. In the joint stock companies and trusts, this is obvious. And the modern state, again, is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. It is rather brought to a head. But brought to a head, it topples over. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. This solution can only consist in the practical recognition of the social nature of the modern forces of production, and therefore in the harmonizing with the socialized character of the means of production. And this can only come about by society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that of society as a whole. The social character of the means of production and of the products today reacts against the producers, periodically disrupts all production and exchange, acts only like a law of nature, working blindly, forcibly, destructively. But with the taking over by society of the productive forces, the social character of the means of production and of the products will be utilized by the producers with a perfect understanding of its nature, and instead of being a source of disturbance and periodical collapse, will become the most powerful lever of production itself. Active social forces work exactly like natural forces, blindly, forcibly, destructively, so long as we do not understand and reckon with them. But when once we understand them, when once we grasp their actions, their direction, their effects, it depends only upon ourselves to subject them more and more to our own will, and, by means of them, to reach our own ends. And this holds quite especially of the mighty productive forces of today. As long as we abstinently refuse to understand the nature and the character of these social means of action, and this understanding goes against the grain of the capitalist mode of production and its defenders, so long these forces are at work in spite of us, in opposition to us, so long as they master us, as we have shown above in detail. But when once their nature is understood, they can, in the hands of the producers working together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. The difference is as that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning in the storm and electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc. The difference between a conflagration and fire working in the service of man. With this recognition, at last, of the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definitive plan, according to the needs of the community and of each individual. Then the capitalist mode of appropriation, in which the product enslaves first the producer and then the appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the products that is based upon the nature of the modern means of production. Upon the one hand, direct social appropriation as means to the maintenance and extension of production. On the other, direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and of enjoyment. Whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. Whilst it forces on more and more of the transformation of the vast means of production already socialized into state property, it shows itself the way to accomplish this revolution. The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinction and class antagonism, abolishes also the state as state. Society thus far, based upon class antagonism, had the need of the state, that is, of an organization of the particular class which was, pro tempore, the exploiting class. An organization for the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and, therefore, especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited classes in the condition of oppression, corresponding with the given mode of production slavery, serfdom, wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into a visible embodiment. But it was this only so far as it was the state of the class which itself represented, for the time being, society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave owning citizens. In the Middle Ages, the feudal lords. In our own times, the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjugation, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy in production, with the collision and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act, by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. This is, at the same time, its last independent act as a state. The state interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase a free state, both as it to its justifiable use at times by agitators and as to its ultimate scientific inefficiency, and also of the demands of the so-called anarchists for the abolition of the state out of hand. Since the historical appearance of the capitalist mode of production, the appropriation by society of all the means of production has often been dreamed of, more or less vaguely, by individuals as well as by sects, as the ideal of the future. But it could become possible, could become a historical necessity only when the actual conditions for its realization were there. Like every other social advance, it becomes practicable not by men understanding that the existence of classes is in contradiction to justice, equality, etc., not by the mere willingness to abolish these classes, but by virtue of certain new economic conditions. The separation of society into an exploiting and an exploited class, a ruling and an oppressed class, was the necessary consequences of the deficient and restricted development of production in former times. So long as the total social labor only yields a produce which but slightly exceeds that barely necessary for the existence of all, so long, therefore, as labor engages all or almost all the time of the great majority of the members of society, so long, of necessity, this society is divided into classes, side by side, with the great majority exclusively bond slaves to labor, arises a class freed from directly productive labor, which looks after the general affairs of society, the direction of labor, state business, law, science, art, etc. It is therefore the law of division of labor that lies at the basis of the division into classes. But this does not prevent this division into classes from being carried out by means of violence and robbery, trickery, and fraud. It does not prevent the ruling class, once having the upper hand, from consolidating its power at the expense of the working class, from turning its social leadership into an intensified exploitation of the masses. But if upon this showing, division into classes has a certain historical justification, it has this only for a given period, only under given social conditions. It was based upon the insufficiency of production. It will be swept away by the complete development of modern productive forces. And in fact, the abolition of classes in society presupposes a degree of historical evolution at which the existence, not simply of this or that particular ruling class, but of any ruling class at all, and therefore the existence of class distinction itself, has become an obsolete anachronism. It presupposes, therefore, the development of production carried out by a degree at which appropriation of the means of production and of the products, and with this, of political dominance, of the monopoly of culture, and of intellectual leadership by a particular class of society has become not only superfluous, but economically, politically, intellectually, a hindrance to development. This point is now reached. Their political and intellectual bankruptcy is scarcely any longer secret to the bourgeoisie themselves. Their economic bankruptcy recurs regularly every 10 years. In every crisis, society is suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, which it cannot use, and stands helpless face to face with the absurd contradiction that the producers have nothing to consume because consumers are wanting. The expansive forces of the means of production burst the bonds that the capitalist mode of production had imposed upon them. Their deliverance from these bonds is the one precondition for an unbroken, constantly accelerated development of the productive forces, and therewith for a practical, unlimited increase of production itself. Nor is this all. The socialized appropriation of the means of production does away not only with the present artificial restrictions upon production, but also with the positive waste and devastation of the productive forces and the products that are at the present time the inevitable concomitants of production and that reach their heights in the crisis. Further, it sets free for the community at large a massive means of production and of products by doing away with the senseless extravagance of the ruling class of today and their political representatives. The possibility of securing for every member of society, by means of socialized production, an existence not only fully sufficient materially and becoming day by day more full, but an existence guaranteeing to all the free development and exercise of their physical and mental faculties. This possibility is now, for the first time, here, but it is here. With the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously, the mastery of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definitive organization. The struggle for individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man, in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom and emerges from mere animal conditions of existence into real human ones. The whole sphere of conditions of life which environ man, and which have hitherto ruled man, now comes under the dominion and control of man, who for the first time becomes the real, conscious lord of nature, because he has now become master of his own social organization. The laws of his own social action hitherto stand face to face with man as laws of nature foreign to and dominating him, will then be used with full understanding and so mastered by him. Man's own social organization, hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, now becomes the results of his own free action. The extraneous objective forces that have hitherto governed history pass under the control of man himself. Only from that time will man himself more and more consciously make his own history. Only from that time will the social causes set in movement by him have, in the main and in a constantly growing measure, the results intended by him. It is the essence of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Let us briefly sum up our sketch of historical evolution. 1. Medieval society. The individual production on a small scale. Means of production adapted for individual use, hence primitive, ungainly, petty, dwarfed in action. Production for immediate consumption, either for the producer himself or his feudal lord. Only where an excess of production over this consumption occurs is such excess offered for sale, enters into exchange. Production of commodities, therefore, only in its infancy, but already it contains within itself, in embryo, anarchy in the production of society at large. 2. Capitalist revolution. Formation of industry, at first be means of simple cooperation and manufacture. Concentration of the means of production hitherto scattered into great workshops. As a consequence, their transformation from individual to social means of production, and transformation which does not, on the whole, affect the form of exchange. The old forms of appropriation remain in force. The capitalist appears. In his capacity as owner of the means of production, he also appropriates the products and turns them into commodities. Production has become a social act. Exchange and appropriation continues to be individual acts, the acts of individuals. The social product is appropriated by the individual capitalist. Fundamental contradiction hence arise all the contradictions in which our present day society moves and which modern industry brings to light. A. Severance of producers from the means of production. Condemnation of workers to wage labor for life. Antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. B. Growing predominance and increasing effectiveness of the laws governing the production of commodities. Unbridled competition. Contradiction between socialized organization in the individual factory and social anarchy in the production as a whole. C. On the one hand, the perfecting of machinery made by competition compulsory for each individual manufacturer and complemented by a constantly growing displacement of laborers. Industrial reserve army. On the other hand, unlimited extension of production, also compulsory under competition for every manufacturer. On both sides, unheard of development of productive forces, excess of supply over demand, overproduction and products. Excess there of laborers without employment and without means of existence. But these two levers of production and of social well being are unable to work together because a capitalist form of production prevents the productive forces from working and the products from circulating unless they are first turned into capital, which their very superabundance prevents. The contradiction has grown into an absurdity. The mode of production rises in rebellion against the form of exchange. D. Partial recognition of the social character of the productive forces forced upon the capitalists themselves, taking over of the great institutions for production and communication, first by joint stock companies, later by trusts, and then by the state. The bourgeoisie demonstrated to be a superfluous class. All its social functions are now performed by salarized employees. 3. Proletarian revolution. Solution of the contradiction. The proletariat seizes the public power, and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society henceforth an anchorism. In proportion as anarchy in social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Man at last, the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master, free. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish, this is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. And with that, we have come to the end of this book. After this long episode, this episode was quite longer than the other two parts. We have ended the book. This is an amazing book. I love this book. I've loved it since I started reading it, and it really inspired me in many ways. And really, I mean, specifically inspired me when it comes to, for example, the dialectics parts. You know, dialectic materialism, and then this final part um, where Engels is talking about historical materialism, right, and explaining and giving an analysis of history through the dialectic materialist, process, I guess, if you want to call it that, is great. It really is interesting to kind of go through the process of a history. Of course, he basically starts with he doesn't go all the way back to what he calls the primitive communist state that we live in. He basically focuses more on the capitalist mode of production, and basically gives you a little summary of what Marx talks about in Capital, which I find kind of funny that he draws attention to Marx's book. And this last part has been great. Of course, we're going to be doing next week. There's going to be one more episode, which I am going to, like every other series, basically do a small summary or like I don't know if I would call it a review, but it's basically me reflecting on what I thought of the book and getting deeper into the contents of the book and trying to basically present my understanding of it, as it's something that I always do. And, of course, I'm doing it with this book too. But focusing now specifically at the end, at this, the last part of this chapter, where Engels kind of goes into the absurdities of the contradictions inherent of of bourgeois society and the world we live in still, because these contradictions are still very present, is so interesting. And the way that he talks about it is in time at times it's almost humorous, the way that he talks about it, as being like this, like, what the fuck is going on? This is so stupid. This is absurd. This is mind-numbingly like incomprehensible. Like it's like, what are we doing? This is stupid. It makes no sense. mostly when it comes to like talking about the crisis, like the economic crisis, the crises or crises that we've gone through. And it's funny because like Engels was far from knowing from what happened then in 1929, then in the 70s. Like there's many more which were to come afterwards, and it just shows that it is a repetitive. It's a vicious cycle that just keeps happening and happening, and there needs to come an end to it. Specifically, that ending was very inspiring. It was also cool to like for him to have like done a bit of a summary of like the different phases of of history, and applying historical materialism in like a very summed up way, and then also presenting the like in a short summed up way what the proletarian revolution needs to look like, essentially, or what it needs to achieve. Is very inspiring. At the same time, it can also be very kind of depressing, because it's like Engels had these ideas over 100 years ago, and yeah, still haven't happened. But at least for those who are curious and want to kind of have a understanding of what there what no what we can do, what can we do to change things. There's kind of a clear, like, I wouldn't call it a step by step tutorial, but there's a clear kind of like map of what can be done and what should be achieved, right? At the end of the day, as Engels put it, we want to be free. We want to be, finally in control of our own lives in general, and not be, either controlled by nature itself, as when we were basically, before having developed, technologies, and when we were still hunters, we were basically kind of, you know, dominated by nature. And then throughout the years, we've let each other, dominate each other through these stupid class struggles that we've created. And what we want at the end of the day is to finally be free, to finally be masters of our own life, and to just be able to do what we love. As I really like how Engels put it, as being able to kind of, how did he put it? He said it as following through with like our mental and like and physical like wishes. He says exercise of their physical and mental faculties. The idea that we were going to finally be able to do what we love and not have to worry constantly about survival. And this kind of goes back to that idea of like humanity being, if humanity's purpose is to create art and to express themselves and to be artistic and stuff like that. And it's an idea that I very much like. And this here, he's kind of reflecting it, this idea that we should not have to worry about constantly having to work to be able to eat. We shouldn't have to slave away at a wage. We should just be able to every day wake up and contribute to society as we love to do, basically. Instead of doing everything out of a fear, out of a this kind of how do I put it? This feeling of like, either if I don't work, I'm doomed. It's rather, if it's changing up the mentality behind that, and completely reorganizing society into everybody having a state of mind where the idea is that you don't work to survive, but you work to contribute to society, right? Your work is a small part of society, but you are, an equal important cog in a machine which keeps up humanity, which keeps humanity alive, which in when it comes to capitalism, it's often, often humans are boiled down to mere cogs in a machine. And at the end of the day, as individuals, we're always going to be cogs in a machine. But the issue or the question is, what machine is it that we're cogs of, right? Is this a machine that is that is that where how do I put it? I'm kind of stumbling over my words. I'm sorry, but the idea, for example, in capitalism, it's clear that this machine is not good. It's a destructive machine. It is killing us. It's killing the planet. It's killing our home, and it does not give a shit about anything other than you know other than creating wealth for an already wealthy class. And in socialism, right, in a socialist society, of course you're still going to be, even in a communist society, you would still be a cog in a machine, but it's a different machine. It's a machine that has a completely different nature, right? Instead of feeling like you're contributing to a system that wants to kill you and that doesn't value you, you are valued as an important member of society, because every in a socialist and a communist society, you are seen as an equal, of equal importance to anybody else, and that everybody has their place, and everybody, we must preserve every human life to the best of our abilities, because we are all dependent on each other and we need to be united, etc., right? It's like the it's weirdly enough, it's like the opposite of individualism to be able to have true individuality. It really does take the neoliberal ideas and turn them on their heads, and it's completely different. And in many ways, it's easy to say that it's utopian, but it's quite the opposite. This is not utopian, but rather scientific socialism. Like that was not a very great sentence or way to put it, but I think you get what I mean, right? At the end of the day, the idea of this book is to differentiate what are utopian socialist ideas and what are scientific socialist ideas, and what is a scientific socialist plan or a Marxist plan, because then scientific socialism becomes known as Marxism, which is what we're all about, baby. I don't know what that was. Sorry. It's been a long day. Anyways, if you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us, you can do so over at Patreon. If you would like to support us in non-monetary ways, check out our website to learn how you can support us. Also follow us on social media so that you can be up to the Politdigm news and are always aware of what we're up to, what books we're going to read next, what the next book we're going to read on this series, which I've already picked out, and you might get a sneak peek of it if you follow us on social media. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, which is something that I never say, yet I probably should start saying more. But yeah, do that. We have very exciting content coming up. We have a totally new form of content planned, which is fun. And yeah, I have really nothing else to say other than I'll see you next week. And with the final episode of this series, even though we've already finished the book. So, doing that final little episode. Anyways, see you all next week. Goodbye, everybody.